Okay, so I've been talking a lot already about network access to the Linux system. It's time to look more closely at the setup and management of networking in Linux. Now, predominantly your Linux system is going to be connected via Ethernet. Understand that this will probably be a virtual Ethernet connection, and on power systems that means a virtual Ethernet adapter in the LPAR connected through the VIOS server's Ethernet bridge, which is called a shared Ethernet adapter if you are interested, or through a virtual network interface controller, also known as a vNIC, in the VIOS. That would be leveraging a single root I/O virtualization adapter, also known as an SR-IOV adapter, a port on that adapter. Now, did you get all that? Okay, all right, so let's just say you didn't rewind and you didn't go back and try to figure all of that out. Let's just say that Ethernet adapters will be configured for the Linux LPAR, and then let's focus on the Linux system's handling of those adapters and networking. We're going to leave the virtualization to another course, to another time, okay? All right, so networking is usually configured for the Linux operating system during installation. And this might be because the setup was done using a script where the networking was defined, right, the installation and the setup, or it might be done via a graphical menu using vNIC where the networking configuration is entered in menus. So it might be an automated installation, it might be a manual installation, but likely networking is going to be set up. And understand, I'm talking about standard TCP/IP network configuration here, nothing fancier than that. You know, a host name, an IP address, subnet masks, routes, that kind of stuff. So you're probably already familiar with the concepts, and again, some of this can be and will most likely be set up during installation. But let's look at the tools in the Linux operating system to modify the configuration, to do further configuration, or to just view it. All right? Now, the primary tools for managing networking and TCP/IP in Linux are in the IP route 2 package. The IP command is your primary command. It's used to show or manipulate routing, network devices, interfaces, and tunnels. The table in the graphic shows the IP command. Now, this isn't the only command in the IP route 2 package, but it's the one you'll probably use the most. The IP command syntax requires an object or an argument, and the route and address objects are the most commonly used, right? Route and address. The syntax then calls for a command. Now, the possible commands are things like add, delete, list, or show. And not all objects support all commands. And if the command is not supplied, there is usually a default, and the default is usually the list or show command. So to take an example, the simplest use is IP space address, or ADDR, or as lazy folks like me like to shorten it, IP space A. Okay, the default command is list or show, so the result of entering IP space A is a list of all the interfaces and their configuration. Now, let's think about how powerful this is. You don't know anything about a Linux operating system, you manage to get in, you're trying to get somewhere else, you don't know where, you don't know why you're not getting there. IP space A will tell you what your networking configuration looks like. Very powerful. Okay, but where did that configuration information come from? Or better said, how was the configuration actually done? Well, if it wasn't done during installation, as I mentioned earlier, which it probably has been, it would be done using IP adder or IPA space add, for example. Okay, now the configuration information is kept in the etc sysconfig network-scripts directory. That's etc/etc/sysconfig/network-scripts. Now, there'll be a file for each of the interfaces defined on the system, including devices like bridges or bonds. Okay, this is much more detail than you would need for your fundamental Linux networking administration. And then those files contain the interface's configuration information. So the graphic that you see now shows an example of the if cfg-eth0 interface entry in the etc sysconfig network-scripts directory. Now, by the way, eth0 is a real Ethernet adapter, in this case, not a virtual adapter. And the inset graphic that appears now shows the IP commands used to configure the IP address and display the results of the configuration. Now, although unlikely, you might use the GUI to configure networking. The graphic on the screen shows the clickstream you follow to reach the dialog where IP parameters can be entered. As with most things in Linux, networking is controlled by a service. The service is called appropriately networking. Now, as you see on the graphic, the system control arguments are pretty straightforward: start, stop, and restart. Of course, if you're going to be stopping network, be sure you're accessing the Linux system via a console and not the network. The networking service will start automatically when the system boots. And finally, if you want to see the status of the networking service, you use the status argument. An example is shown here in the graphic. Look for the active status line. In the example case, the service is active.